Hello, everyone. This is the Salty Scientist, here to fulfill a special request from someone I often have debates with on the topic of climate policy. He's very much on the right of the aisle politically, and naturally sent me a Heritage article titled "Who's the Cleanest of Them All?" by Stephen Moore. Judging by Moore's contributions, including Trump's trade triumph, liberal war on work, and 8 reasons to still hate Obamacare, we can judge this person to also be right of the center. I figured we'd look briefly over the article and critique the main points. The 3 points, as described by Moore, are as follows. China produces the most emissions. Nearly every nation, primarily the EU, has violated the Paris Agreement. And literally, quote, "The left cares far more about the good intentions than actual results." Well, I guess we'll get into that. On the first point, yep, China absolutely produces the most emissions. Big surprise for a country that's over 4 times the size of the United States. In 2015, China produced over 9,000 million metric tons of CO2, almost twice as much as the US, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists. However, when you consider the history or cumulative emissions, the US has contributed 1/3 of all CO2 artificially contributed to our atmosphere today, more than any other country. China is responsible for less than 1/6, due to its only recent expansion in historic terms. And yet, China still has largely stabilized its emissions, with promises to peak emissions in 2030. Per capita, or per individual, the US is the second most wasteful nation on Earth after Saudi Arabia in the top 10 emitters category, twice as wasteful as China. Moore further cherry picks data, this time a finding from a BP study that showed that in 2017, the US reduced emissions by 0.5%. My response to that is, thanks, Obama. Under the Trump administration, the US is predicted to increase its emissions by upwards to 2% this year alone, according to the US Energy Information Administration. So much for the cleanest of them all. Next point. The EU has not violated the Paris Agreement. It's quote-unquote off track or off target, according to their own audits. There are many reasons for this, including much the same conservative resurgence we've seen in the United States. And unfortunately, we are well aware of the effect of this administration on science and policy. Despite this, the EU reduced emissions from 1990 levels by upwards to 23%, compared to the US, who only increased emissions from 1990 until 2005. This goes back to the previous point. How can the US criticize China while we also produced emissions for years after the EU reached its peak? The EU may be behind on its promises, but it has accomplished more than the United States and is still a leader in climate policy. The last point fascinates me. Pulling out of the Paris Agreement is meant to have, quote, good intentions, decreasing expenses, increasing jobs, and easing burdens for blue-collar workers, especially coal miners. I guess we need to dig us out of the hole Obama got us into. Except, let's see how these changes affected the areas living with coal economically. This is a map of the economic health of Appalachia in 2002. This is in 2016, and this is in 2018, according to the Appalachian Regional Commission. There's almost no difference. These areas have some of the poorest counties in the nation. Guess where the sickest states are? Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee are in the top 10 worst states for health, according to the United Health Foundation. A study conducted in 2016 found that 26,000 premature deaths in the US are mainly the result of coal-fired power plant emissions. Adding scrubbers would have reduced those deaths. But in the words of Stephen, I suppose, they care far more about good intentions than good results. To summarize, China produces the most because it's developing and has 4 times the population. The US will increase emissions thanks to Trump. And the EU is behind in its promises in the Paris Agreement, but hasn't violated anything. Finally, deregulating will have limited positive effects overall, when considering health and long-term economic costs. People need reputable sources. Consider multiple sources before ascribing to misleading or cherry-picking articles. And be critical of the ones you listen to or read, especially mine. If you see any mistakes or have any questions, please ask away. Thank you for listening. Sources are in the description.